Islam actuel.
Go ahead, Imtiyaz.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. First of all, let me thank and welcome everyone on the behalf of Islam Actual, and thank you to Brother Muhammad for inviting me to be the moderator. And it is an honor to have Professor John Esposito here with us. Before I introduce him, I want to say something. It is very interesting that in a way, Professor John Esposito is the first graduate student of Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi, and I am the last student assistant of Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi. So from awwal and akhir. And I want to, and something very interesting has happened yesterday and today. One student of Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi, who was with us, Dr. Ghulam Nabi Fai from Washington D.C, visited the grave of Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi yesterday, and he sent us the photographs. So I'm going to share those photographs with you, so you can, inshallah, we'll feel his spirit here.
Maybe just...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, while you are sharing it, I can translate and also add that we are the first readers of Dr. Esposito here, so it's really a continuity. So, juste pour traduire, du coup, salam alaikum pour tous les auditeurs français. Docteur Imtiyaz, professeur Imtiyaz est sur le point de présenter professeur Esposito avant de commencer, et il soulignait juste que professeur Esposito est le premier étudiant du professeur Al-Faruqi, et que professeur Imtiyaz est le dernier. Du coup, c'est une continuité. Donc, alhamdoulilah, c'est vraiment un honneur de les avoir avec nous aujourd'hui.
Okay, let me see if I can share. Yes, okay. This is the grave of Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi, which is a student of Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi, visited yesterday, and he shared these photographs with us and with me yesterday, Professor John Esposito today. Both Dr. Ismail Al-Faruqi and his wife, Dr. Lois Lamia Al-Faruqi, are buried together next to each other. And when he visited there, he was not alone. There was another person there who was there before. So he said to me that people have not forgotten Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi. It is a very interesting thing to note. This is the second picture. He is here with his wife, and this is his offering Surah Fatiha as Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi. So I wanted to show this to get it started, so that Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi will be with us, and Dr. Lois Lamia Al-Faruqi will be with us in spirit, inshallah. It is a pleasure and honor to invite Professor John Esposito. I think Amina wanted to say something. Amina, go ahead.
Am I the one you are talking about?
Yeah, Melissa, yeah. You wanted to explain the photographs?
Thank you very much. It speaks for itself, mais du coup, vous avez vu les photos, c'était les photos de la tombe de professeur Al-Faruqi, rahimahullah, du coup. Et il expliquait qu'il avait visité sa tombe récemment, et qu'en arrivant, il y avait des personnes qui étaient déjà présentes, et que du coup, ces personnes montraient qu'il fallait entretenir la mémoire, et que du coup, c'est une manière de le faire, notre réunion aujourd'hui. Alhamdoulilah.
The topic for today is Ismail Al-Faruqi, a universal thinker, and there is no other person to talk about this more efficient, more proper to speak about this than Professor John Esposito. Let me introduce him. He is a distinguished university professor of religion and international affairs and Islamic studies, and founding director of the Prince Alwaleed Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, and of the Bridge Initiative Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia at Georgetown University. In 2019, he was the S. Rajaratnam Professor of Strategic Studies at Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. And as you mentioned, he has published a lot His list of books is 55 books. I can't mention all of them here, but only mention a few. What everyone needs to know about Islam, Sharia, the future of Islam, who speaks for Islam, religion and violence, unholy war, the Islamic threat, myth or reality, Islam and democracy after the Arab Spring, Islamophobia, and the challenge of pluralism. And his books have been translated into 45 languages. Besides that, he is the past president of the American Academy of Religion and Middle East Studies Association of North America. He is a member of the World Economic Forum Council of 100 Leaders and the European Network of Experts on De-Radicalization, a senior social scientist for the Gallup Center for Middle East Studies, and ambassador of the UN Alliance of Civilization. He has served as a consultant to the US Department of State and other agencies, European and Asian governments, corporations, universities, and media worldwide. Professor Esposito, please take.
Thank you very much. Let me begin.
I'm really sorry. We will have to translate every time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Très rapidement, donc, un grand honneur d'avoir professeur John Esposito avec nous, qui est un professeur des universités sur les religions, également en Islamic Studies, sur les relations internationales, donc beaucoup de sujets. Également un professeur en stratégie. Il a écrit beaucoup de livres, notamment Islam et démocratie, aussi sur l'islamophobie. Je pourrais vous laisser consulter plus précisément ces listes. Ces ouvrages ont été traduits dans plus de 40 langues, dans 45 langues. Donc, très impressionnant. Et il a également occupé beaucoup de postes, notamment auprès de départements d'État des États-Unis, secrétaire d'État, des agences européennes également, et sur des travaux autant sur la décolonisation que sur l'islamophobie, etc. Donc, une grande figure.
Let me begin by saying that I'm delighted to be with you. For those of you who are students, I didn't intend to say this in my talk, but perhaps I will. When I was a younger academic, my mother and father came to a lecture, and after it, people said, you know, how do you feel when you see him on the stage? And my mother said, oh, at least he has a job. At least he has a job. And then they said, what was he like as a child? Did he read? And there are three boys in the family. She said, well, all the boys read, but with John, I had to have books that had lots of pictures. That wasn't just because I liked a lot of pictures. It was, I really wasn't all that much of a reader. So the fact that I've maybe published a fair amount just means that anybody can do a lot of different things. I think you're aware of the background of Ismail, so I will be somewhat brief about that. Obviously, Ismail was born in Palestine. When he came to the States, he studied at Harvard and then went to Indiana University and finished his PhD. He then went to Al-Azhar University in Cairo and spent 4 years studying Islam. He came to the States and then moved to Temple University. He was a very active academic and scholar, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in my talk.
Thank you. Juste pour traduire très rapidement l'anecdote que le professeur Esposito nous donnait, il disait que quand il était plus jeune, ses parents lui avaient rendu visite quand il donnait un cours, et que ses parents lui disaient au moins il a un travail quand il disait au moins il a un travail dans le sens où il ne se rendait pas compte que c'était une position importante, mais au moins il a un travail, il a sécurisé l'aspect financier. Et le professeur Esposito rappelait que quand il était petit, lorsque les gens demandaient à ses parents si leurs enfants lisaient, il disait que oui, mais pour John, du coup, il faut des livres avec beaucoup de photos parce qu'il aimait, pour le forcer à lire, parce que finalement, il n'aimait pas beaucoup la lecture. Tout ça pour dire que passer de ça à énormément d'ouvrages publiés, il rappelait ça dans le sens tout le monde peut le faire, donc il faut s'accrocher, c'était notamment à destination des étudiants. Donc là, après ça, il a rappelé assez rapidement la biographie et le background, on va dire, de professeur Al-Faruqi, en rappelant les universités par lesquelles il était passé, notamment Al-Azhar, et que finalement il s'est basé à Temple University aux États-Unis et qui était très actif en tant que professeur.
Ismail was a prolific scholar, publishing more than 25 books, including the Cultural Atlas of Islam and 100 articles. But he was also very much an activist in terms of implementing things. So, for example, the American Academy of Religion, which was seen as the largest academy dealing with world religions, back in those days, it had no coverage of Islam. And it was Ismail with some of his graduate students, and I was blessed to be one of them, that pressed the American Academy of Religion to include Islam in a permanent way. We had to prove ourselves for about 4 years that we had enough interest in what we did. And today they have many, many different panels at their meetings.
Just for the English speakers, I'm really sorry. We will have to translate in French. We cannot do the at the same time listening and translating. So we will have to speak in French just a few seconds. I'm sorry for that. Donc juste pour traduire rapidement, donc il rappelait qu'il était très actif aussi dans le sens où l'islam n'était pas un sujet au moment où Al-Faruqi devenait professeur. En tout cas, c'était pas légitime de traiter de ce sujet dans le champ académique et que du coup, le professeur Al-Faruqi a beaucoup contribué à ce que ce sujet soit traité et étudié au même titre que les autres religions d'ailleurs, parce que ça n'était pas quand il est arrivé.
Ismail also was among the founders of IIIT, the International Institute for Islamic Thought, working with Tahir Jabir Alwani and a number of other scholars and activists, Jamal Barzinji and Anwar Ibrahim, the current Prime Minister of Malaysia. At that time, Anwar was a Deputy Prime Minister, and they created IIIT in 1981.
Donc, il rappelait que le professeur Al-Faruqi, pour justement illustrer le fait qu'il soit vraiment actif, il a fondé le Islamic Institute, Institute for Islamic Thought.
Yes. Islamic Thought, yeah.
Donc, en 1991, et à ce moment-là, il travaillait déjà avec les pointures sur le sujet, notamment l'actuel Premier ministre de Malaisie qui était dans cet institut avec Al-Faruqi à ce moment-là.
Faruqi was also a groundbreaker in the field of interreligious studies, early on becoming active in interfaith dialogue. One of the people who created the notion that there was is Abrahamic faith or tradition. That is, that we just don't talk about Judaism and Christianity, but rather Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are interrelated religious traditions.
Il a également beaucoup contribué à développer les études interreligieuses, enfin, une approche interreligieuse, notamment à faciliter le dialogue entre les différentes confessions. Et c'est lui qui a notamment souligné la notion d'approche des religions abrahamiques, en fait, de ne pas seulement parler du judaïsme et du christianisme individuellement ou à deux, mais de montrer que c'était relié aussi à l'islam et qu'il y avait une continuité entre ces trois religions monothéistes.
Ismail played a very special role in my life, and I guess I should refer to that. He only met my parents once, and that was at a meeting of the American Academy of Religions in New York. To my surprise, although I should have understood, Ismail said to my parents when he met them, well, you're his physical parents, but I'm his intellectual parent. And that's the way he and Lamia actually dealt with all of their academic children, that is the graduate students.
Il souligne une anecdote en disant que quand on était plus jeune, le professeur Al-Faruqi avait rencontré les parents de professeur Esposito en lui disant vous êtes ses parents physiques, biologiques, on va dire, mais moi je suis son père intellectuel, pour montrer qu'ils avaient un lien très particulier et que le professeur Al-Faruqi était comme ça aussi avec tous ses étudiants.
When I first went to Temple University, I had absolutely no desire to study Islam. I never intended to. and in fact was initially resistant when it was recommended that I study Islam. At Temple, you had to major in one religion and minor in two. I intended to major in Catholic theology, and early in my life, I had been in a monastery, then left and became an academic who taught Catholic theology, and I intended to minor in Hinduism and Buddhism. But it was the chairman of the department, when I said I wanted to work in Hinduism, that spent a lot of time telling me I should at least take one course in Islam with Ismail.
Il rappelait que de base, il n'avait pas forcément de volonté d'étudier le sujet de l'islam. Il était même plutôt résistant, enfin, ça ne lui venait pas du tout en tête. Mais à Temple University, il devait réussir à valider plutôt une matière concernant une des religions. Et à la base, il pensait au catholicisme parce qu'il a fréquenté, enfin, il était dans un monastère. En tout cas, il a beaucoup fréquenté les cercles plutôt catholiques. Mais il a pensé à ça. Puis ensuite, il a pensé plutôt à l'hindouisme et au bouddhisme à étudier pour pouvoir valider. Et finalement, c'est des gens de ce même département qui lui ont conseillé de au moins s'intéresser au sujet de l'islam et de voir s'il pouvait en faire un sujet d'étude.
To give you an idea of Ismail's strength of character and the fact that he often functioned almost as a father in giving us instructions, when I first met him to talk about the one course that I was going to take, he said, "We need to plan your course of study." And I said, "Well, why would I be planning my course of study?" He said, "Well, if you're going to major in Islamic studies and do your PhD." And I said, "I'm not going to do a PhD in Islamic studies." Then he said, "Don't worry about it." Eventually, about 4 months later, he asked me to meet him in his office and said, "Fill out these papers to study Arabic at the University of Pennsylvania." And I said, "Well, why would I study Arabic at the University of Pennsylvania?" He said, "In order to continue to work in Islamic studies." I said, "Well, I'm not going to major in Islamic studies."
Il décrivait donc encore une fois une anecdote, il expliquait une anecdote avec le professeur Al-Faruqi en disant en montrant à quel point il était très actif et qu'il voulait engager les gens sur ce sujet. Il rappelait ça en donnant cette anecdote quand il s'est dirigé donc vers le professeur Al-Faruqi pour s'intéresser à cette matière avec l'islam. Le professeur Al-Faruqi a commencé à lui dire bon, on va planifier toutes tes études, on va voir jusqu'où tu vas aller. Et le professeur Esposito lui disait mais je veux pas continuer à faire des études, je veux pas faire de doctorat en fait dans ce sujet. Le professeur Al-Faruqi lui a dit t'inquiète pas, tu verras. Et ensuite il l'a orienté vers l'université de Pennsylvanie. Il l'a beaucoup incité à apprendre l'arabe, à faire des études en arabe. Le professeur Esposito lui a dit mais pourquoi je ne veux pas continuer. Et le professeur Al-Faruqi l'a poussé encore une fois en lui disant mais si tu veux faire un doctorat sur le sujet de l'islam, il faut que tu connaisses l'arabe. Donc c'est pour montrer à quel point il a beaucoup poussé.
So then he said to me, "Sit down and fill this out." So I thought, okay, I'll fill it out. I'm never going to get this fellowship. It was very, very competitive. And then the next thing I knew, I got the fellowship. And that led to my going to Lebanon and studying at a language school run by the British, the Middle East Center for Arab Studies. But by then, I had become very affected by the course that I was in with Ismail, and was just, there are a lot of things that are important. What came to quickly was that when we look at history and look at the history of religions, it's not as if it's a Judeo-Christian, Judaism, Christianity on one side and Islam on the other, but rather it's triple tradition, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Il souligne du coup qu'il a rempli des papiers pour s'inscrire et il a obtenu sa bourse pour pouvoir étudier la langue arabe. Il a étudié au Liban. Et il rappelait aussi qu'il soulignait qu'il avait vraiment été beaucoup touché par les cours du professeur Al-Faruqi et que c'est ça qui l'a de plus en plus intéressé au sujet d'étudier l'islam. Et dans ce sens-là, il rappelait que l'histoire des religions, et ça l'a beaucoup marqué, on avait l'habitude de la présenter comme quelque chose de judéo-chrétien, avec une approche sur ces deux religions monothéistes seulement, mais qu'il s'est vite rendu compte que ça ne devait pas être ça, mais plutôt une approche des trois religions et que c'était important de garder cet aspect de continuité et de tradition.
I think few people realized just how important a role he actually played, in the sense that within a very short time, he built a thriving program in Islamic studies. But the way that it was done was that every year he would travel in the Muslim world and raise funding for it, whether he was dealing with governments or individuals. And so most of the students in my class came from Muslim countries, from North Africa to Southeast Asia. That influenced the way in which I also experienced and understood Islam. I wasn't at in those days, if I had been at another university, I would probably have been taught by a non-Muslim, and there would have been very few Muslims in the class. But in this case, it came alive for me. That is Islam and Muslim life.
Il rappelle qu'il pense vraiment que le rôle du professeur Al-Faruqi sur ses champs de recherche est vraiment sous-estimé. Il a beaucoup contribué pour justement faire de ces sujets autour de l'islam en milieu académique des sujets légitimes. Par exemple, il allait chaque année dans des pays du Moyen-Orient pour aller chercher des financements pour continuer à enseigner ça, du coup là où il était à Temple University, et que les étudiants qui étaient auprès de lui ont vite été rejoints par des étudiants qui venaient de l'Afrique du Nord, des pays d'Afrique du Nord, des pays du Moyen-Orient. Et le professeur Esposito soulignait que ça a vraiment beaucoup influencé sa compréhension de l'islam, que ça a été très positif de pouvoir justement être entouré de musulmans venant d'un peu partout, et que ça lui a donné une nouvelle vision de la vie en tant que musulman et de l'islam vécu par les musulmans.
Actually, Ismail himself went through a transformation. When I first studied with him, and he would have seen his identity as a Palestinian and an Arab Palestinian and a Muslim. But as he said to one Muslim scholar a number of years later, until a few months ago, I was a Palestinian, an Arab, and a Muslim. Now I am a Muslim who happens to be an Arab from Palestine. So that was a significant shift in the way that he saw his own identity and the world.
Le professeur Esposito rappelle un peu aussi un autre aspect de Al-Faruqi sur comment il approchait son identité, et qu'à ce niveau-là, il a connu une vraie évolution, puisque le professeur Al-Faruqi avait l'habitude de se présenter comme étant un arabe palestinien, donc un palestinien et musulman. Et ça a progressivement changé lorsqu'il s'est présenté auprès d'un autre professeur en lui disant qu'avant il pensait ça, mais que maintenant il se présente comme étant musulman, qui est il happens to be, donc un peu, ça aurait pu être autre chose, qui est un musulman, non, qui est musulman et qui est un arabe venant de Palestine, et ça aurait pu être autre chose. Donc ça a vraiment, il y a eu un shift un peu dans son identité, et le caractère musulman a pris la place principale.
Back in those days, then, we had basically as compared to today, when we have many Muslim scholars in the United States teaching at universities. But back in those days, there were three major Muslim scholars that were in the United States. Syed Hussein Nasser, who is still alive and thinking, and I believe he's still even teaching, Fazlur Rahman and Ismail. Fazlur Rahman and Ismail both have passed on. But basically, in those days, they were the big, what would I show, the big Muslim scholars in terms of, at least for many of us in the United States, and they had at times significant differences among them.
Could you write, while I translate, could you write their names in the conversation, please?
Let's see.
No, it's okay. I will do it.
Okay, it's well, you can just say, well, Syed, and then just Hussein, Nasser, N-A-S-R. And then Fazlur Rahman is F-A-Z-L-U-R, Rahman, R-A-H-M-A-N.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Donc, ces deux professeurs avec le professeur Al-Faruqi étaient les trois seuls professeurs musulmans et sur ces sujets de l'islam aux États-Unis à ce moment-là. Maintenant, il y en a beaucoup plus, mais c'est pour montrer à quel point le professeur Al-Faruqi avait vraiment une position de préfondateur. En tout cas, il était parmi ceux qui ont lancé ça aux États-Unis.
Studying a temple in those days was something very new. Temple University had only become a university. Before that, it had been a religious sort of school or university. So that was in the late 60s that it came into existence. And the program in Islamic studies did not come into existence until around the middle of the 1960s. But the difference, again, and I mentioned it briefly before, for me was not only did I have a Muslim professor and mentor, but that the vast majority of my classmates were from the Muslim world. And so it wasn't the same, but it was a bit like having the experience of traveling and spending time in the Muslim world before I actually even went to the Muslim world itself.
Vous rappelez que vraiment, donc, comme il le disait, ces études autour de l'islam à la Temple University, c'était vraiment pas présent. Ça a mis du temps à arriver et les programmes autour de ces sujets se sont implémentés plutôt dans les années 60. Et au plus que d'évoquer ces sujets qui n'étaient pas évoqués, c'était la première fois, en tout cas pour le professeur Esposito, qu'il avait un professeur musulman et des étudiants musulmans autour de lui. Donc, sans même voyager ou partir des États-Unis, il pouvait vraiment rencontrer des personnes musulmanes et qui pouvaient lui illustrer. En tout cas, il y avait cette diversité parmi les étudiants. Sa promotion.
And, you know, Islam alive, because when you were in class, it wasn't just you something and a professor said something, but we would get into a discussion. For example, we were talking about hadith. You would then have, you know, Muslims who would talk about hadith in a living way and what it meant to them, how they understood it. At the same time, it took me initially a bit to adjust to Muslim culture, because when we had our first exam, a classmate of mine asked to borrow my book. And I said, fine, but I need it back by Tuesday. And he said, inshallah, I'll get it back to you by Tuesday. And then we continued the conversation, and I was a little nervous. And I said, I want to emphasize, Anis, I need the book by Tuesday. And he said, inshallah, I'll get the book to you. And I said, finally, I said, Anis, I'm getting nervous. I need you to not only tell me God willing, but I need you to tell me that you're going to guarantee that you get the book to me.
La force aussi et l'aspect positif de pouvoir être entouré d'étudiants musulmans, c'est que non seulement il étudiait l'islam en cours, mais il le voyait en vie, entre guillemets, à travers ces étudiants musulmans qui l'entouraient. Il pouvait avoir des discussions, par exemple, sur les hadiths qu'il étudiait en cours et comment les étudiants musulmans témoigner de la manière de le vivre en fait dans le quotidien. Et le professeur Esposito rappelait un peu en rigolant une anecdote sur le fait qu'il a dû s'adapter aussi entre guillemets à la culture musulmane et la comprendre quand il a prêté un ouvrage à un de ses camarades en lui disant, et par contre il faut que tu me le rendes vraiment pour mardi, et que le camarade lui a dit, je te le rendrai Inch'Allah, et que le professeur Esposito était assez stressé, il en avait vraiment besoin, donc il lui a dit, il faut vraiment que tu me le ramènes pour mardi, et qu'il lui a dit, oui, je te le ramènerai, Inch'Allah. Il lui a dit, il ne faut pas seulement, Inch'Allah, il faut aussi que tu le fasses vraiment. Donc, c'est des choses qu'il a appris des choses avec lesquelles il a vécu et dont il a compris la signification et la force après.
Yeah, I didn't intend to give you the next story, but I think it's an interesting one. I was in London once waiting to be picked up to go to the northern part of London, which is heavily, Muslim. And so a woman was driving me, wearing a niqab. She was in the front of the car. I was in the back of the car. And I told her the story I just told you now. And she said, I know exactly what you mean. She said, my husband is Jordanian. And when I ask him to do something, he says, Inshallah, I'll do it. And she said, now I wind up saying to him, no, I want to know, Inshallah, are you going to do it? Or Inshallah, you're not going to do it. She said, I have to emphasize with him. And that made me feel that she understood what I was going through at that time.
Il dit que ça lui a rappelé d'autres anecdotes, cette anecdote-là, quand il était à Londres et qu'une femme qui lui a de dire et qu'elle lui a dit mais je comprends tout à fait, mon mari il est jordanien et même chose quand je lui demande quelque chose il me dit Inch'Allah et elle est obligée d'appuyer en disant mais c'est Inch'Allah tu le fais ou Inch'Allah tu le fais pas en fait. Donc c'était intéressant qu'il retrouve avec une personne étrangère, c'est même oui c'est la même situation.
And I didn't realize at the time the advantages of studying in this Muslim context within a university until I started to travel to countries in the Middle East and also to Malaysia. And so many people would always ask me, why did I study Islam? And in many cases, at the end of a lecture or in the middle of a lecture, they'd raise their hand no matter what I was lecturing on, it seemed, and say, if you understand Islam so well, why are you not a Muslim?
I was waiting for the answer, but I'll translate first. Il disait que donc, quand il parle de ses avantages, de toutes ses expériences, dans le fait d'avoir étudié entouré de personnes musulmanes, quand il voyage, notamment dans les pays musulmans, et il parle ici de la Malaisie, peu importe le sujet qu'il traite et le cours qu'il fait, à la fin, il a toujours cette même question, je pense, vous voyez où on va, c'est vous avez réalisé tout ça, vous le présentez, du coup, est-ce que vous êtes converti à l'islam ou pas?
The difference, and I only mean this in, I don't want to overemphasize it, but I think the difference was back in those days that if you were studying Islam, your professors who could be experts in the area would have been trained in a history department. There were no religion departments where you could get a PhD in Islamic studies. And so it was a very kind of different kind of training, both as a professor, being immersed ahead of time, actually when you're studying in a kind of Muslim context, and therefore the kind of attitude or ability one had to see certain aspects of Islam as a living faith, in the very study of Islam, in the very classroom experience.
Il souligne un aspect justement dans les relations, enfin la position des professeurs lorsqu'ils enseignent l'islam, notamment à ce moment-là, dans les années 60, donc avant que la période Al-Faruqi, etc., c'était que celui qui enseignait les sujets autour de l'islam, c'était les professeurs qui étaient passés par le département d'histoire. Il n'y avait pas de département propre justement à la religion ou département académique propre à ces sujets. Donc ça pouvait être compliqué pour certains professeurs qui avaient entre guillemets que ce background d'études en histoire, ça évoquer l'islam et faire face aussi à des questions très pratiques avec les étudiants sur le quotidien de ce que l'islam prend comme forme.
At the same time, the genius of Ismail's project was that he brought Muslims from different parts of the Muslim world. He didn't just bring them from the Arab world or a certain country. So he knew he was training a generation of whom would go back to their countries, but also that for Muslim students, as for me, you majored in one religion and you minored in two. And Muslims, therefore, they had Christianity and Islam, for example, or Hinduism or Buddhism. So they themselves were then exposed to a religiously pluralistic world. And I saw it only a few years ago when I was in Doha at the College of Islamic Studies there. I'm on their academic council. And there was one of my former students who I hadn't seen fellow students. We studied at Temple together. I hadn't seen him for at least 50 years, if not more. And we talked about his work, and he was teaching Judaism in Cairo at American University of Cairo and writing on the topic.
Une des forces aussi de ce qu'a pu faire Al-Faruqi dans cette université, c'était d'unir les étudiants et encore une fois, dans la même dimension, de permettre l'étude d'interreligieuse et encourager à étudier les autres religions aussi. Et les musulmans, donc à ce moment-là, les étudiants musulmans à Tappan University, ils étaient obligés aussi d'étudier d'autres religions, c'est encore avec les matières à valider, pour pouvoir avancer dans leur cursus. Et c'est justement une force qu'il souligne. Et il donnait l'anecdote récemment, il était à Doha du coup, et il a croisé un ancien camarade à lui qui maintenant enseigne des sujets autour du judaïsme au Caire. Donc c'est quelque chose qui est resté et qui a permis ces sujets, ces croisements entre les religions.
Another interesting aspect was Ismail's involvement with the Nation of Islam. That is, he invited me to go to a dinner in Philadelphia that was given by the Nation of Islam. And at that time, the Nation of Islam was, in its beginnings, was seen as very marginal in terms of its, at least by some of us, in terms of its full Islamic character. It was very much into a form of nationalism. It also was very critical of U.S. Culture, of Western culture. They tended to be a community unto themselves. And at the dinner, I leaned over to him and said, I guess I was talking in a kind of Salafi fashion, but it was, is this Islam? And he said, and I said, why are you so involved? And Ismail just took a long-term view. For him, this was part of both his intellectual approach as well as his academic and religious approach doing da'wah. And he basically said to me, in time, they will come within, if you mainstream Islam. And of course, that's exactly what happened a decade or two later.
C'est quelqu'un qui a un maniste au micro. Ah non. I'm sorry. Okay. Yes, perfect. Donc le professeur Esposito parlait de Nation of Islam, du coup, qui est un mouvement afro-américain musulman aux États-Unis que vous avez sûrement entendu parler, dont vous avez sûrement entendu parler. Et il disait qu'il avait, le professeur Faruqi intervenait beaucoup, en tout cas participé à des dîners notamment de ce mouvement. Et plusieurs fois, il a pris pour le professeur Esposito avec lui. Et ce mouvement, à ce moment-là, c'était un mouvement assez critique sur les États-Unis. Et c'était un mouvement communautaire renfermé sur lui. Et ça avait frappé le professeur Esposito qui lui avait la question à professeur Al-Faruqi en lui disant, est-ce que c'est vraiment ça l'islam? Pourquoi vous les fréquentez alors qu'ils ne sont pas en accord avec votre vision? Et le professeur Al-Faruqi lui a répondu, tu verras que dans un certain temps, entre guillemets, ils se calmeront, quoi. Dans ce sens-là, plutôt, ils rejoindront l'islam orthodoxe, les enseignements d'islam orthodoxe. Et le professeur Esposito soulignait que c'est exactement ce qui s'est passé et c'est ce qu'est le mouvement aujourd'hui, beaucoup moins critique et virulent et communautaire que dans les années 70. 80.
And I'm going to tell you something now that normally in a regular talk you might not expect, but we, at one of the professional meetings, my wife and I had breakfast with Ismail and his wife. And everything, for me, everything that Ismail did, he did in a big way and really committed himself to it and enjoyed it. And the same thing was true at breakfast. He ordered pancakes and the waitress came with 4 packages of syrup to put on the pancakes. And he immediately asked for another 4, which was incredible. The 4 was supposed to be for the whole table, for all of us. And he basically emptied almost 8 of them onto his pancakes and just absolutely enjoyed it. And I remember thinking years later when I thought back to it, I just thought in so many other ways, he seemed so disciplined, and he could be so serious. But I could also see how when he had a passion for something, he made sure that it was done. And in a reverse way, well, no, let you translate that before I say what I'm going to say.
C'est une anecdote assez rapide pour illustrer le fait que Faruqi était très déterminé et lancé quand il fait quelque chose, et il prenait l'exemple d'un petit déjeuner que le professeur Esposito et sa femme ont eu avec le professeur Al-Faruqi et sa femme, et qu'ils avaient commandé des pancakes pour le petit déjeuner du coup, et que dès que ça a été servi, le professeur Al-Faruqi en a redemandé directement. Enfin, c'est une illustration assez, anecdote assez drôle, mais pour montrer que c'est dans ces petites choses du quotidien que le professeur Esposito retrouve aussi sa détermination.
When I finished at Temple, I had no idea just how well known Ismail was internationally, in the Muslim world in particular. But I discovered going out as a young academic who I had no visibility or reputation, but wherever I would go, Ismail had already been there. And the fact that I was his student gave me a special, there was a special reception for me. People were open to meeting with me. You know, for example, in those days, and some of you won't recognize the names, but somebody like Hassan Tarabi, who was very prominent in the Arab world, also throughout, and in the United States, but from the Sudan, and the head of the Muslim Brotherhood there, or members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or if I was in Malaysia, I would meet with Anwar Ibrahim, who was the deputy prime minister at that time and is the current prime minister, and who as a young man had been one of the founders of an Islamic youth movement there. But this was true in so many different countries.
Le professeur Esposito rappelait que quand il a terminé son cursus à Temple University, à chaque fois qu'il allait dans un endroit où il rencontrait des gens, le professeur Faruqi était déjà passé par là pour montrer à quel point, encore une fois, il était actif vraiment dans tous ces domaines. Et que les personnes qu'il a rencontrées et qui ont été leaders et qui sont devenus des leaders de mouvements importants concernant les musulmans et dans beaucoup de pays, que ce soit au Soudan, en Malaisie, du coup, il y a les noms dans la conversation. Mais le professeur Faruqi les avait déjà rencontrés, voire influencés. Donc, il s'est rendu compte à quel point le professeur Faruqi avait vraiment une très grande place dans toutes ses réflexions.
I should mention that both Ismail and Lamia in particular, in many ways, they treated the graduate students as if we were their children, their surrogate children, you know, in that they would constantly be inviting us to their home. The kind of advice that I would get from Ismail or Lamia, you know, they would be ready to give it very freely. And a sign of Ismail's influence and strength is that when I defended my dissertation successfully, I wanted to go home to see my parents immediately that evening. But no, Ismail insisted that I go to his house for dinner, and then that we go to a concert on the music of Beethoven. His wife was an expert on music, which was the last thing that I wanted to do. But it was as if I had a parent telling me that they expected to see me. And so I did what he wanted.
C'est une anecdote assez drôle. Donc, il rappelait que bon, voilà, le professeur Faruqi était proche de tous ses étudiants, comme il le disait tout à l'heure, qu'il les soutenait beaucoup, toujours dans cette figure un peu, une approche vraiment d'un père avec ses fils. D'ailleurs, le professeur Faruqi invitait très souvent ses étudiants pour dîner chez lui. Et un exemple de ça, lorsque le professeur Esposito a soutenu son mémoire, dissertation, il a réussi et donc il était très content, pressé de rentrer chez ses parents, mais le professeur Faruqi l'a limite presque forcé à aller dîner chez lui et ensuite à assister à un concert de musique de Beethoven. C'était la dernière chose qu'il voulait faire, comme disait le professeur Esposito, mais ça montrait à quel point il était généreux aussi avec ses étudiants.
there was one question that came after I finished and had already started to develop my career. He invited me to the faculty club at Temple, and I finally asked him this question that was always in my mind. I said, you know, you never asked me if I'd considered becoming a Muslim. I don't usually discuss this publicly, but I just thought I would say that. And it was very interesting, his response, which was, well, I'm your professor, and as an academic, I can't do that. He said, I'd probably love that you decided to become a Muslim, but I'm a professor, and so there's this fine line. But there was also the other side that he said, and that was that he said that he recognized that in some ways, I had a special role to play, in the sense that I was, when I was as a non-Muslim speaking to non-Muslim audiences in the West or wherever, that I had a certain voice, that if I were a Muslim, they'd say, well, that's what we would expect. Well, he's a Muslim and he's talking about his personal faith, and so they wouldn't see that what one was talking about, one was being objective about. And, you know, where you could see that an aspect of this is a number of times when certain organizations that are Islamophobic or leaders, when they would be upset with some position that I took, they would start, there's always been a rumor that in fact I am a Muslim, only I keep it secret, that I haven't said that publicly.
Une des choses auxquelles il repense et qui peut l'intriguer, c'est que quand il avait été professeur Al-Faruqi, il l'avait invité bien après qu'il ait été diplômé, qu'il soit devenu professeur. Et professeur Esposito lui a demandé, mais je réalise que vous m'avez jamais demandé si je pensais, si ça m'était venu en tête de me convertir à l'islam. Et le professeur Al-Faruqi lui avait dit, en tant que professeur, c'est la ligne un peu rouge, je ne peux pas te demander ça, je reste ton professeur avant tout. Mais le professeur Al-Faruqi lui soulignait que même s'il ne se convertissait pas, il avait quand même un rôle important à jouer, notamment face aux non-musulmans, en étant une voix, en étant non-musulman face aux non-musulmans, en fait, il gardait, entre guillemets, aux yeux des non-musulmans, une certaine légitimité, puisque les non-musulmans, et notamment les islamophobes, pourraient dire que quand un professeur musulman parle de l'islam, il disait de toute façon, c'est sa religion, donc il n'est pas objectif. Mais du coup, qu'on pouvait jouer un peu sur ça en étant non-musulman. Et justement, il rappelait que, le professeur Esposito rappelait que très souvent, des groupes islamophobes, en fait, pour le délégitimer, pour le critiquer, ils disent mais il y a une rumeur qui dit qu'en fait le professeur Esposito s'est converti à l'islam et c'est pour ça qu'il fait tout ça. Et en fait, juste cette simple anecdote, ça montre que ça, malheureusement, ça garde encore, c'est encore un aspect important on garde une voix plus légitime que des musulmans lorsqu'on est non musulman et qu'on parle de l'islam. Donc on intéresse plus les non musulmans.
An interesting experience that he and I shared was during, at the beginning of the revolution, the Islamic Revolution. And I was approached by some people who wanted to see if there could be a delegation of respected Muslim scholars and leaders who would go to see Ayatollah Khomeini to get the Iranians to release the American hostages. And in fact, although he was initially hesitant, I spent a lot of time talking to him about the project. He signed on to it. We went to Switzerland and we had a meeting with different people and we had to talk to them. That is, they came to Switzerland. They happened to be at a large meeting that was already scheduled on another topic. It was a large meeting of just, Muslim leaders, etc. And eventually they agreed to be involved. At the end of the day, it didn't work out because the people who were going to have to fund it felt that there was there was no guarantee of success. That kind of almost business kind of mentality. It's a kind of it has to be a no risk project. And have guaranteed success. But the fact that Ismail and others were interested in that was important. And subsequently, Ismail did go on his own for a meeting with Khomeini. Now, I don't know what he talked about when he went there, but I do know that he did go there and have that meeting.
Professeur rappelle le moment de la révolution islamique en Iran, du coup, de tête en 1979, où en fait, il y a eu des réflexions autour du fait d'envoyer des professeurs musulmans qui étudient l'islam américain pour se rendre en Iran et rencontrer Al-Khomeini pour le convaincre de libérer des otages américains. Donc, en tout cas, d'envoyer une délégation pour pouvoir le rencontrer. Et Al-Faruqi a vraiment été engagé et a porté un peu ce projet. Ça a failli aboutir lorsqu'ils avaient réussi à convaincre certains influenceurs, dirigeants musulmans d'aller en Iran. Finalement, puisque c'était risqué et que c'était beaucoup plus complexe que juste une discussion, le projet a un peu été abandonné. Mais en tout cas, Al-Faruqi a vraiment œuvré pour que ça puisse se faire. Et finalement, il est quand même parti seul rencontrer Al-Khomeini, mais le professeur Esposito dit qu'il ne sait pas de quoi ils ont discuté, mais qu'il l'a rencontré de son côté.
Another example was when I was invited right after the Iranian Revolution. The State Department had an agency which dealt with sending American academics to Muslim countries. So, for example, to tell them about American culture, American history, American law. And in these countries, you often had a program that had a small library so that people in the country could come there, etc. Well, they asked me if I would go and speak in the Muslim world. And there was a big discussion and debate, even I think within some of those that asked me, because the question was, does government get involved in this kind of project dealing with religion? And the fact that I was a non-Muslim. As it turned out, it became very successful. But, I had asked Ismail for his advice because at least in those days, I don't know today, depending on what country one is in, but back in those days, if you were really knowledgeable about something, about Islam, and you weren't a Muslim, and you were asking questions, there would always be the suspicion that somehow you were associated with the government, that you might be CIA. And so I've been very resistant to that. But then when he went to answer me, he said, "John, that's your decision." And I perfectly accept it. And then he had his jacket off, and we were at the Temple Faculty Club having lunch. And he rolled up his sleeves and basically said, you can say no to this, but on the other hand, this can be an important project. And so you can roll up your sleeves. And he basically had his sleeves rolled up and get on with the jihad. So it was a very interesting, time and an interesting way for him to phrase this advice.
Encore dans cette période du moment de la révolution iranienne, après ce temps, des personnes avaient approché le professeur Esposito pour qu'il puisse faire un certain nombre de conférences en Iran, parce que l'idée de l'étranger était invitée. Just a few seconds, sorry for that. Okay.
That's right.
Ok, donc, lui, il avait été proposé pour aller donner des conférences en Iran, mais que ça pouvait être risqué risqué pour lui, et puis les personnes intervenantes, notamment étrangères et notamment américaines, pouvaient être considérées un peu comme des espionnes travaillant pour le CIA. Donc il avait demandé conseil au professeur Faruqi qui avait un peu, enfin, lui avait concrètement dit, c'est à toi de décider. Effectivement, c'est dangereux, effectivement, mais en fait, ça peut être aussi une très belle opportunité. Donc, c'était pour montrer que il avait ses conseils aussi, le professeur Al-Faruqi.
As a result of being trained by Ismail, what I found when I traveled in the Muslim world, whether it was my involvement in that project or as an individual scholar over the years, it was in the early days when people didn't see, I didn't have any books, they didn't know me, they had no experience with me. Being trained by Ismail, it enabled me to deal in situations and communicate in ways that people understood and that they found surprising. Now, this has changed a bit now, but back in those days, there was very much a sense that you could have scholars of Islam, but there was a kind of sense or belief that they couldn't quite really understand Islam, if you will, from a faith kind of perspective. But I think that the unique experience that I had being trained not only by Ismail, but being with the graduate students who came from all over the Muslim world, was that, as I said before, my engagement was not only an intellectual engagement with Islam, but an engagement with, if you will, the faith of Islam and the way in which that played out in its diverse ways among my Muslim colleagues.
Il me rappelle et souligne qu'il est aussi, il réalise et est très reconnaissant d'avoir évolué auprès du professeur Al-Faruqi, parce que ça lui a aussi permis d'apprendre à communiquer, à échanger aussi avec d'autres d'autres chercheurs musulmans et de manière générale tous les musulmans, parce qu'il y avait, et peut-être encore aujourd'hui, un peu la pensée que quelqu'un qui est professeur sur le sujet de l'islam ne peut pas comprendre, et qui n'est pas musulman du coup, ne peut pas forcément comprendre l'islam d'un point de vue de la foi ou d'un point de vue spirituel. C'est quelque chose qui va lui échapper dans tous les cas puisqu'il n'y a qu'une approche académique. Mais le professeur Esposito, le fait d'avoir fréquenté le professeur Faroukhi, mais aussi les étudiants musulmans et d'avoir... oui, c'est ça, évoluer à leur côté. Il réalise que ça l'a beaucoup aidé aussi pour comprendre des choses qui, en gros, il n'aurait pas forcément pu comprendre dans les livres académiques, quoi.
So what was Ismail's contribution at the end of the day to Islamic studies? It was a contribution that laid the groundwork for, in the American Academy of Religion today, there are so many panels on Islam and Islamic studies. It was training generations, of Muslims and of Muslim scholars who were not just Westerners, but many of them were Muslims who went back to the Muslim world. I remember once I ran a conference in Southeast Asia, running it out of Kuala Lumpur. And at the time, at a certain point in the discussion, someone said to me, publicly, I don't think you realize it, but, we see you as the head of the temple mafia, meaning that, the temple crowd that studied Islam during those days. And that experience was repeated years and years and years later. It was repeated only a couple of years ago. So after many, many years, I went to a wedding in Malaysia and immediately discovered that there were 3 tables of members of the temple mafia, Malaysians who had studied there. And we had all kinds of group pictures being taken, etc. But it reinforced the sense that although Ismail passed on and died so many decades before, it was a living testimony to the impact that he had not only in Malaysia, but in so many other countries, and the impact that he had from students, from students like the 2 former students of his that you're meeting today, and the work and writing and speaking and conferences that we've run. All of those things make for a really a global impact and legacy. The final area I want to address is just very briefly is that of religious pluralism. Ismail was active not only in dialogue, but also in trialogue. That is, in the early days when there was religious dialogue, it was between Christians and other Christians. And then it was between Christians and Jews for a long time. Muslims were always, even in academia in terms of studying, you had the Judeo-Christian tradition when you're studying religion, and then Muslims were put with Hindus and Buddhists, et cetera, as areas to study. Ismail was able to participate in the first trialogues where you had Muslim, Christian, and Jewish religious leaders and or scholars come together and play a significant role. He was in many ways a transitional figure. He did not train formally in Islamic studies until after he finished his PhD, when he went to Al-Azhar. He then had some influence in spending time in Montreal and Pakistan, but really the major interest was from his base in the United States, but from a base where he, as an individual scholar, and most scholars that I know, in those days certainly, did not travel throughout the Muslim world regularly, and every year, every couple of months, and did not have a program that had so many students in it and that they were being trained. Because this was a time when there were no jobs in Islam in the United States. When I finished my degree in 1974, there were no jobs. There was no interest in Islam. There were no opportunities to publish books, etc. Islam was in many ways invisible. And all that changed. But when it changed, there were some of us who were able to have been trained to address the issues of the day, whether it was in the West or in the Muslim world, and had linkages with people in the Muslim world already. And that was due in large part to Ismail Al-Faruqi. Thank you.
Pour une grande question aussi, je crois que ça va être la dernière, c'est quelle est la contribution et quelle a été l'influence d'Al-Faruqi sur ces Islamic Studies, du coup, le champ des études islamiques, comme si on traduit littéralement, c'est un rôle vraiment hyper prégnant et très, très, c'est un des rôles principaux dans le développement de ce champ académique, au point où c'est un surnom, il y a le groupe des gens d'Al-Faruqi et des gens qui l'ont suivi de la Temple University, il était appelé la Mafia Temple ou Temple Mafia, parce que c'est vraiment là le cœur en fait de tout ce qui s'est lancé ensuite autour de ce sujet, notamment quand il va même à l'étranger, il parlait de Kuala Lumpur, quand il rencontre dans des événements, les gens venant de la Temple University sont vraiment reconnus, c'est une grande légitimité dans ce champ et tout le monde reconnaît l'apport et les efforts qu'Al-Faruqi a apportés pour ça. Il a œuvré pour cela. Et un autre apport qu'il souligne aussi, c'est comme il évoquait, le dialogue vraiment interreligieux, où en fait, avant, c'était un dialogue dans le sens où c'était des chrétiens qui discutaient avec d'autres chrétiens, on va dire d'autres tendances à l'intérieur du christianisme. Puis ensuite, le dialogue s'est un peu ouvert entre le judaïsme et le christianisme, mais l'islam était toujours absent de ces discussions, de ces religions, des discussions autour des religions monothéistes. Et Ismail Al-Faruqi a vraiment contribué à changer ça. Et c'est lui qui a organisé, il a participé dans ses premiers temps, ces trilogues, on va dire, en tout cas ces dialogues où les trois religions monothéistes étaient rassemblées autour de la table. Donc c'est vraiment une figure emblématique, sachant que de base, l'islam n'était pas le sujet principal de ses études avant son doctorat, et ça joue. Il y avait ça, et aussi parce que l'islam en tant que tel n'était pas du tout un sujet abordé dans le champ académique, absolument pas reconnu, pas de travail, pas de métier, ni de poste plutôt de professeur ouvert sur ça. Et voilà, une grande invisibilité, et le professeur Al-Faruqi a vraiment contribué et à rendre légitime ce sujet et à faire des ponts entre les pays. C'est pas seulement resté aux États-Unis, mais aussi des ponts avec les pays musulmans, comme professeur Esposito le rappelait, avec les étudiants musulmans venant de l'étranger. Donc, une très grande contribution.
You must be exhausted. That's incredible.
Est-ce que je suis fatiguée? No, it's okay. It's really a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I will go and I would go to the questions which are coming in the chat box. So I will read the questions first, and then Melissa will translate them into French, and then you can respond. So it's kind of a longer route, but we will go through it.
Okay.
Well, let me say this, that we talked about Temple Mafia. I'm also a member of that, but John is the Don of Temple Mafia.
Oh, okay. Just before we begin the questions, il disait que c'était le Don Corleone limite de la mafia Temple, le professeur Esposito. Just before continuing and taking the questions, maybe I can let you, Professor Imtiyaz, read the English questions in the conversation, and then I'll talk with them. I'll also take some questions in the room. We are really, really honored to welcome Dr. Abdulaziz Berhout, who is the director of ISTEC in Malaysia, and he's here in the conference, I think. So we are really honored to welcome you. And so everyone, do not hesitate to write some questions in the conversation. Même chose du coup pour les Français, n'hésitez pas à écrire des questions, ou ce sera plus simple plutôt que d'ouvrir le micro. Et on a avec nous le directeur de l'ISTAC de Malaisie qui est ici, donc on est très contents.
Okay, so John, the first question is about Islamization of knowledge from Bidauddin Sayyid Isa. Would you say that the Islamization of knowledge project was started by Faruqi and Al-Attas separately or together, like Faruqi doing it in the US and Al-Attas doing it in Malaysia?
I know that obviously they had interaction. I know it from the early days. Al-Attas, for example, spoke at a conference in Philadelphia, was the keynote speaker. But I also know that one time in Kuala Lumpur, we had a dinner, and there were, Al-Attas was there, and the Sayyid Hussein Nasser was there. And it seemed to me that there were a natural thing that some of us have is an ego about what we do. My name is John L. Esposito. Sometimes I say my name should be John E. as an ego Esposito. And at that dinner table, I was being told very nicely by people something like, well, I was actually the first person who really used that phrase, before Ismail said it. I think that in many ways they addressed it along the same lines. I certainly think that Ismail, in terms of Islamization of knowledge, was far more influential in getting that phrase out there, and both in terms of what it meant, but also in terms of the debates that existed around it. He had more of a visibility than on this than some others did. And on Islamization of knowledge, you should direct your questions at any point to our moderator here, who is the expert on Ismail Al-Faruqi.
Thank you for that. Pour traduire rapidement, donc la question posée par professeur Imtiyaz, si je me souviens bien, portait sur justement ces trois figures, donc professeur Faruqi et les deux noms m'échappent, mais on les a mis dans la conversation. Le professeur Sayyid Al-Hussein Nasr et professeur Fazlur Rahman, quelles étaient en gros leurs relations et qui a été le plus influent. Et docteur Esposito disait que le professeur Faruqi avait beaucoup contribué sur le sujet de l'islamisation des connaissances, à vraiment étendre le débat et à faire en sorte vraiment que ça devienne un sujet à l'agenda, même dans le champ des études islamiques. Donc, sur ce point, il avait quand même été plus influent.
Okay. The other question I'm going to ask you is from Brother Khalid, is asking about the concept of Tawheed. Do you think there was a common points or differences about the concept of Tawheed between Faruqi and Nasr?
I think that, first of all, I think that the basic concept of Tawheed it's in many ways central to both of them. I think that the difference at times between them, and it's not that there were differences, for example, in their theological interpretation, okay? But I think that the difference in terms of them as scholars is that Nasser's approach is both in terms of the religious and intellectual tradition, but within that, he gives more space, for example, to Sufism, to Sufi thought and its development. And I see Ismail more as so they're both proceeding from faith, okay, and belief, but I see Ismail emphasizing a intellectual and theological approach. Obviously, there's a spiritual dimension to that. And Nasser, though, at times in his work, emphasizes the Sufi side of it and how the commonalities at times between Sufism and other forms of other religious forms of spirituality, particularly Christian.
Donc, le professeur Imtiyaz soulignait une question qu'il y avait dans le chat, une question de Khalid qui posait la question des points communs et des différences sur le concept de tawhid entre le professeur Al-Faruqi et le professeur Nasr. Et le professeur Esposito, les approches étaient assez similaires. Donc, il y avait certaines différences plutôt sur des interprétations méthodologiques, mais que les interprétations étaient globalement similaires. Surtout, il fallait surtout souligner que le professeur Nasr avait peut-être une approche un peu plus spirituelle et qui donnait plus de place au soufisme, notamment, lorsque le professeur Faruqi soulignait un aspect plutôt théologique et intellectuel en parlant de la notion de tawhid.
Okay, the next question to Professor Esposito is, what were the major points of disagreement between you and Dr. Faruqi, and how did you two go about it? How did you confront, if you did confront your views at all?
Well, that's like, I tend to think with Ismail, in some ways, probably it would be a little bit the same as with my dad, with my father. And so it's very kind of respectful, very open. But my father, when his sons would disagree with him on something, would say something like, like we were discussing economics or politics in America, something, you're too bright to be that stupid, And with Ismail, I was always very careful because he knew so much more than I did. I think that maybe the differences in approach was that, for example, in the area of Islamization of knowledge, for me, that was his area, and that was an area that I felt I wasn't interested in getting in. For me, because our paths went differently, he introduced me to so many people who were intellectuals, Muslim intellectuals and religious leaders. But I was more interested in writing about then the role of Islam in contemporary Muslim society, and writing about the emergence of Islamic movements in different countries. That wasn't the case with Ismail, even though he knew so many of the leaders, etc. So he was much more the intellectual theologian, philosopher, but I think than my style. I had been trained in theology, in Catholic theology, and I realized at a certain point that I wasn't going to be very good at getting a doctorate in it because I'd fall asleep when I was reading it in books. So I always liked dealing with Islam in not only in history, but Islam and and in its life and aliveness in Muslim societies, in terms of the interaction of religion with society and politics and pluralism.
Hiba, who is a student, a person that attends our book club, so that's why the question is really interesting. Donc Hiba qui a posé la question, quels ont été les points de désaccord majeurs entre le professeur Esposito et le professeur Al-Faruqi, et comment ils ont évoqué, comment ils ont deal avec ça. Donc le professeur Esposito disait que c'était un peu une relation, encore une fois, donc comme un enfant qui voudrait contredire son papa, donc le contredire, mais toujours avec grand respect. Et la notion un peu sur laquelle c'est pas qu'ils sont moins entendus, mais que le professeur Esposito était moins intéressé par ce sujet, c'est la notion d'islamisation des connaissances, où le professeur Al-Faruqi c'était son sujet et il était très engagé sur ça. Le professeur Esposito l'était un peu moins. Le professeur Al-Faruqi avait l'habitude de le présenter à beaucoup de personnes engagées à ce moment-là sur la question, d'autres professeurs de pays, etc., dans d'autres pays, etc. Mais le professeur Esposito a plus l'habitude d'écrire plutôt sur l'histoire des mouvements, vraiment l'approche de l'islam avec une approche plutôt historique en lien avec la dimension sociopolitique des pays, pendant que le professeur Al-Faruqi avait plutôt une approche théologique, intellectuelle du sujet. Si vous avez des questions ici.
Yeah, now the question from Hamidullah Marazi from Kashmir. Why do you think Faruqi was opposed by people like Wilfred Cantwell Smith and not as well received in the West as Said Hussein Nasr is received?
That's an excellent question. That really is. I got to tell you that I've given a lot of talks in my life, but some of these questions are really quite good. Yeah, and it's they're quite challenging for me, because now you're getting into not only my intellectual but my personal sense. I think Wilfred Cantwell Smith and Wilfred in his time was groundbreaking in terms of, as it were, looking at and getting Islam, attention for Islam in the academy, but I think that to begin with, their personalities were completely different. Wilfred Cantwell Smith was very much the way some people see a scholar, a personality that looks like they're always very thoughtful, maybe smoking a pipe. Not that he smoked a pipe, but the kind of approach. Ismail was visceral, intellectual and visceral. So Ismail had no problem raising very tough questions or issues, and raising them. I remember, for example, in graduate school, the Department of Religion at Temple had all the world religions represented. Okay, and the people who taught a religion had to be either born into it or, let's say, converts, to it. Ismail at one point did what Martin Luther did. He went to the offices of some of the colleagues who were Christian theologians in background, and he nailed onto as Luther did on the front of the cathedral, the challenge to some of the beliefs. And basically challenged them to a debate over some of the beliefs that he felt some of the modern Christian theologians were not dealing with or walking away from, like the virgin birth, like, a whole set of things, you see? And so that's, that when you're doing that can be somewhat confrontative. And in a conference, Ismail could be very passionate when he would speak. And wasn't afraid to really underscore just how much he disagreed with somebody, and then he'd be ready to go out for a good lunch. But in the academy, for many academics, you don't sort of do that. Okay, for many academics, if you, I believe I'm saying this publicly. But for many academics, they may disagree with you, but they'll do it in print. They don't have to be there face-to-face, and really not often do it face-to-face. For Ismail, and there were a number of other Muslim scholars at the time that would just say what they really thought. And I think that deep down, I don't think Cantwell Smith would say it, but I think the sense would be that Ismail was coming from this as a very strong believer in what he believed and articulating that position. You know, he prided himself on knowing German, French, and English in addition to Arabic, knowing Western civilization in addition to, so he felt he was a player, you know, he, like another one of the professors I was close to, Hassan Hanafi, had met Khomeini, for example. But at a certain point, when you're talking to people like Khomeini, or sometimes in the old days with one of the sheikhs of Al-Azhar, I had the same situation, where you really ask that tough question and take that position, the response you get is, well, I don't deal with that. It's like, I'm here at the top decision-making. You can talk to one of my proteges here about this issue. So it was not only Cantwell Smith, it was for some others too. I think he was, you know, he was very strong, you know, and could be very controversial, you know, on a topic. I can remember one time, both myself and Lamia, I was at their house, and we were both saying, don't get so upset about this. You know, say it in a different way when you're going to say it in this context. That's what I'm struggling with right now in terms of how I want to answer this, but go ahead.
Oui, il y a une question qui était posée, c'était pourquoi, enfin, quels sont un peu les points de base d'opposition entre Al-Faruqi, oui, pour voilà, les contradictions qu'il y a pu avoir entre, enfin, les critiques plutôt, qu'il y a pu avoir sur Faruqi par des professeurs de la même époque, notamment Smith, et pourquoi Faruqi a été moins bien reçu que pour d'autres professeurs comme le professeur Nasr, qui était du coup on a dit qu'ils ont évolué ensemble sur les mêmes sujets. Et en fait, une réponse très intéressante du professeur Esposito, c'est que ça aussi, il y a un aspect tout à fait personnel qui peut expliquer ça, en tout cas des personnalités. Il soulignait le fait que Faruqi, c'était quelqu'un de très, il a dit visceral, on va le traduire comme brut, qui disait très concrètement et franchement ce qu'il pensait. Par exemple, il donnait l'exemple d'une conférence qui avait été organisée par le département des religions à la Temple University, et que tous les représentants des religions étaient présents. Tous les représentants des religions étaient autour de la table. Ils étaient soit du coup nés de cette religion, soit convertis. Et en fait, le professeur Al-Faruqi n'hésitait pas à aller les challenger, à leur poser des questions directement sur pourquoi dans votre religion c'est comme ça, aller vraiment pas les invectiver, mais aller leur poser des questions qui sont sujettes à controverse et très directes, exactement. Et en fait, ça peut être une explication du fait qu'ils soient entre guillemets moins bien accueillis, parce que notamment dans les cercles académiques, en fait, les chercheurs se contredisent à l'écrit de manière très douce, enfin pas douce, je veux dire, en tout cas calculée. Non, quand même pas, mais en tout cas, ce n'est pas une confrontation, c'est toujours avec les angles très lissés. Et le professeur Al-Faruqi n'était pas du tout comme ça, il allait vraiment directement dans la confrontation, au point où il fallait... le professeur Esposito se souvient de moments où il lui disait « il ne faut pas que tu dises ça comme ça, sinon ça ne va pas passer ». Mais voilà, comme le professeur Al-Faruqi croyait très profondément en ce en quoi il défendait, bah, il le défendait avec tout autant de vigueur. Donc, ça peut aussi expliquer ça. Mais c'est intéressant, ça montre aussi les aspects un peu qui relèvent de la personnalité et qui viennent entrer en jeu dans l'évolution des légitimités des chercheurs après, dans leur postérité. Voilà. The next question is in French, so maybe I can translate it in English first, and I'll let you answer, professor. On a jusqu'à quelle heure, du coup? Okay. We'll try to do all the questions, and we are going to be Okay, so we have a question here. So let me first translate the question in French. I'll read it in French first. C'est celle de Semira. Quelle est la thèse principale selon vous, le fondement de paradigme de la vision et enseignement d'Ismail Al-Faruqi, qui selon vous ont bouleversé l'approche et la compréhension de l'enseignement de l'islam et du Coran afin d'être appliqué par les musulmans pour améliorer le monde dans lequel nous vivons. Okay, it's a tough one. I'll say this to the professor. What is for you the main thesis, the main subject that from the vision of Faruqi and of his will to create a paradigm based on Tawhid? So what is the main thesis that for you kind of really challenged the approach that we have today of Islam and of the Quran, and that could be applied by Muslims today in our world? Did you understand it? It's quite difficult, but
Yeah, it is. I will try to answer it, but you can say to the person that asked me that I may be missing the point. I think that Ismail was somebody who felt that both within Islam, but also dealing with the way Islam was understood by others and the Islamic tradition was understood by others, wanted to create a model in which one could talk about the centrality of the oneness of God, and how, if you will, all the parts of Muslim belief and practice relate to that, or are within that oneness. Okay, and where you could, and I think that he made Tawheed and the way he dealt with it and talked about it, in a sense, kind of come alive. You know, back in those days, it wasn't as if there were a lot of people who spent a lot of time on Tawheed. That is, they would discuss it. Scholars would say Tawheed means X, you know, etc. But for him, he was always, because he understood and saw himself as understanding Islam very well, but also Western civilization. He felt that there was a kind of unique way in which Tawheed played a special role and model in terms of what the ultimate truth was. Okay, and I can remember being at a dinner with him, and we were sitting with two of my Hindu colleagues whom he knew, who were professors. They were scientists, but when they went up to get dinner, you know, he said to me, "They're so bright, but they've got this tradition that has, you know, all these gods and goddesses." Okay, now they came back, and then he got up and he went to get his food, and they said of Ismail, "He's so bright, but he's got this strong, you know, for them, rigid approach to understanding and, you know, fitting this in. If you've got a certain vision of Tawheed, then, you know, shirk gets used in a number of contexts for certain approaches." I think that's really, you know, to me, that was the difference.
Thank you for that. Il soulignait que le professeur Faruqi, j'espère que ça répondra à ta question, c'est Mérin, mais que le professeur Faruqi accordé une très grande importance à la notion de Tawhid, et ce, dans la compréhension, donc on va dire par les musulmans, de l'islam, mais aussi de la manière dont il doit être vu par les autres et de la spiritualité de manière générale. Et sa volonté, c'était vraiment de créer un modèle universel pour parler de l'unité de Dieu et basé vraiment exactement sur le Tawhid qui venait du coup de ces enseignements de l'islam et de ses réflexions. Et le professeur se soulignait une anecdote où ils étaient en train de dîner avec des personnes hindoues, hindou, oui, c'est ça. Et que lorsque ces personnes se sont levées, le professeur Faruqi est souligné au professeur Esposito, mais ils sont vraiment intelligents, il leur manque vraiment peu une vision avec d'un Dieu unique, basé sur le tawhid, c'est dommage. Et quand l'inverse s'est produit, que le professeur Faruqi s'est levé et que les autres sont revenus, ils ont dit il est vraiment intelligent et intéressant, mais il reste sur sa position d'un modèle rigide, basé sur l'unicité de Dieu. Donc, tout ça pour dire que voilà, le modèle basé sur le tawhid, c'est vraiment ça c'est la thèse principale qu'il a développée et qu'il a voulu, sur laquelle il pensait vraiment qu'on pouvait construire beaucoup de choses qui devaient être la base en fait.
Imtiyaz, if you want to jump in on this, feel free.
Yeah, I will just add here. There are two questions in English, and I'll go to them. And before I go to them, I will just share something here with John. Of course, John is very senior to me. And when I was studying with Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi, and he had just come back on one occasion. He had to mute. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. On one occasion, he had just come back from Iran, and Syed Hussain Nasser was also at Temple University, and he came out of his room and he told Syed Hussain Nasser, "See, I just came back from Iran." So that was kind of Faruqi. And on another occasion, when we had an interfaith conference, interreligious dialogue conference at Temple University, where Hans Kung, you need to put that person out, just expel him out. Okay. On another occasion, we had the interreligious faith dialogue conference at Temple University, where Hans Kung was there, and Professor Faruqi gave a talk, a dinner talk, and he praised Wilfred Cantwell-Smith such a lot that he ended up by saying that Wilfred Cantwell-Smith, and he was there, Wilfred, you are the Christian Al-Biruni of Islam. So this was Al-Faruqi. Okay. You want to translate, Melissa? No, you're muted. You need to unmute.
Oh, sorry for that. It's raining, so sorry. Professeur, du coup, Imtiyaz a rajouté deux anecdotes à propos de professeur Al-Faruqi, qui viennent appuyer encore ça, cet aspect très engagé, où il était revenu de l'Iran, et donc revenu aux États-Unis de l'Iran à l'université, en croisant le professeur Nasser, il lui avait dit t'as vu, je suis revenu de l'Iran, enfin ça l'a marqué. Et pendant, encore une fois, cette même figure l'avait aussi marqué pendant ses discours, ses dialogues interreligieux, où il n'hésitait pas à invectiver les représentants des autres religions.
Okay, two questions to John. I'll give them together, then you can reply them, so that you can save some time. The first question is, do you plan to continue teaching for coming years and extend the chain of knowledge of transmission to younger generation? And how would you interact with your students in a personal way or informal way? This is the first question. The second and the last question is, in today's world, in the Muslim world, there's a lot of discussion on jurisprudence than Tawheed. Basically, talking about there's a lot of discussion on Maqasid al-Sharia, then religion as a discourse, religion as a devotion. So what are your thoughts on this? How can we deal with, the things have moved from the discussion on religion, or from religious discourse to jurisprudential discourse about Islam. So what is your take on that?
Okay, well, I guess to answer the first question, I probably should refer to my age, which I usually don't like to do. Neither when I was younger nor now. In a couple of weeks, I will be 83. I'm still teaching full time. And I started 10 or 15 years saying to people who began to ask me a question like that I wanted them to know that I was training, and now I say I've trained a nurse to bring me in and wheel me in as long as my brain and my mouth are working, I'll continue teaching. Okay. So I therefore see myself certainly for the next 2 years, and beyond that, who knows? With regard to the second question, and interacting with students, it's both formal and personal. The personal is there. I mean, in terms of my dealing with students on a lot of issues, whether it's not all the time, but intellectual or personal, you know. But clearly, when I was younger, it was even easier for students than at this age. With regard to the second question, yeah, the emphasis is very often, a lot of it is on jurisprudence. And Maqasid Sharia, which I think is an interesting concept, and it's an important concept. I think there are times I can remember speaking to a group of undergraduate and graduate students, a large group of them. And at one point in the conference, we were talking about an issue, and then somebody asked me a question like, what else can we do? And I said to them, well, what else is there that you can do? And there was like dead silence. And then I said, pray, pray. And they were like stunned. In other words, we were not talking, when we were talking about dealing with an issue, without realizing it too often, we lose the spiritual dimension, you know, and I think that's a difficulty, you know, whether you're talking about religion, you're talking about theology, it's not just about a concept and a belief, it's also, it's a living belief. And anyway, it's all yours. Try to translate that one.
It's going to be difficult, but I do my best.
Okay.
Donc il y avait une première question qui était est-ce que le professeur Esposito comptait continuer à enseigner? Est-ce qu'il enseigne encore? Et une question assez pratique. Et le professeur disait que oui. Il a même dit tant que son cerveau et sa bouche fonctionnent, en gros. Et il demandera toujours, même s'il faut que quelqu'un le ramène en fauteuil roulant, il enseignera. Donc c'est très fort. Et l'autre question, c'était sur le fait qu'aujourd'hui, beaucoup plus d'importance est accordée à l'aspect jurisprudence et de manière générale, sharia, sciences islamiques, que sur le tawhid. Est-ce que le Faruqi avait apporté une analyse déjà à cette observation? Et comment entraîner, comment inspirer les jeunes à avoir des discours autour de la religion qui sont, qui sont plus empreints de spiritualité. Et le professeur Esposito disait qu'il fallait avoir conscience que, en tout cas dans sa position de professeur en études islamiques, que ce n'était pas seulement un concept ou une notion vide ou quelque chose de très objectif ou cadré qu'est l'islam, quoi, mais qui avait toujours cet aspect spirituel. Et justement, il donnait lui-même l'exemple quand il discutait avec des étudiants qui lui disaient bon, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire pour améliorer, pour avancer, améliorer la cause, etc. Et le professeur, vous l'avez entendu presque crier, dire prier, prier. Donc, c'est même auprès de ses étudiants, l'aspect spirituel, c'est quelque chose qu'il a beaucoup rappelé et dont il a souligné l'importance du coup auprès des étudiants musulmans.
There are no more questions. First, I would like to hear thanks Melissa, because she's translating 2 persons.
1 second.
Do you have any French question?
Yes,
yes, Melissa.
The room. I'm sorry to.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
So we will listen to the French version, and I'll do the English one.
Juste passer le téléphone, comme ça t'actives, comme ça les Français en ligne ils puissent t'entendre.
Okay, just give us 10 seconds. Thank you.
And Melissa, send me an email so I can be in contact with you.
Okay, no problem. So I'll cut and I'll.
J'avais lu dans un livre.
J'avais lu dans un livre qu'on pouvait résumer les travaux de Ismail Al-Faruqi en 4 axes, celui de la civilisation islamique, celui de religion comparée, celui du phénomène sioniste et de l'islamisation de la connaissance. Et dans ce livre, il a été dit qu'il a été assassiné avec son épouse en raison de leur position sur la Palestine, parce qu'il avait aussi mis en avant les racines racistes de l'idéologie sioniste par rapport aux efforts remarquables qu'il avait fait pour promouvoir le message de l'islam en Amérique. Et je voulais voir, lui, sa position en tant qu'étudiant et élève d'Ismail Al-Faruqi. On a parlé de l'islam depuis le début et est-ce qu'il a pu voir, en fait, justement, s'investir sur le sujet de la Palestine et du phénomène sioniste? Et est-ce que lui était d'accord avec cet avis comme quoi il a été assassiné avec son épouse pour cette raison? Merci. Question un peu longue, je suis désolée. C'est long. Je suis désolée.
So I'll translate that. C'est quoi ton prénom? Ton prénom? Hanan. So Hanan was asking a really interesting question. She was saying that she read about the works of Professor Al-Faruqi, and she was saying that we could summarize them with 4 notions like the Islamic civilization, compare religion, Zionist phenomenology, and Islamization of knowledge. So she was reminding this aspect, but she was moreover highlighting the fact that Professor Faruqi and his wife has assassinated, and it is said that they have been killed because of their positions regarding Palestine. So because Al-Faruqi really talked a lot about the racist aspect of the Zionist ideology. So she was asking you, Professor, your view on that, say that Professor Faruqi has been assassinated because of these positions. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the fact is that for a number of us, our first reaction was that might be the case. Because Ismail was very outspoken on it, etc. But as it turns out, that wasn't the case. They eventually found the person who did it. He was somebody who knew Faruqi, had been to his home. He was somebody who was associated with the Nation of Islam, as far as I know formally. But this belief that you just mentioned, this question, has existed for all these years. I mean, I've had people in Singapore, in Hong Kong, who would come up to me and say, it's just terrible that that some Zionist killed him. So but that's not true. Let me make one final comment. For those of you that are interested in the kind of work that our center does, you can go to the website of the center, but particularly when it comes to the question of Islamophobia, when it comes to the question of critiquing a lot of what's gone on in Europe, in France in particular, and Austria, etc., and global Islamophobia, then go to bridge.georgetown.edu. Bridge.georgetown.edu. We have all kinds of information there. And if you sign up, we have something every day where the associate director every day sends out a summary of key articles that have appeared with regard to Islamophobia and what's happening in the world. And she sends out the article link and summarizes so one can stay in touch with that.
Thank you very much. Du coup, il disait que c'est quelque chose une croyance assez répandue qu'il a été assassiné pour ces raisons, mais c'est pas le cas. Du coup, ils ont retrouvé la personne qui l'a assassiné et du coup, ils ont trouvé le motif. Et c'était en fait quelqu'un qui était lié au groupe Nation of Islam, au mouvement dont on parlait tout à l'heure, et que c'était, de ce qu'il sait, c'est une personne qui relevait de ce groupe, donc pas du tout liée à ces questions-là, mais que oui, là où il va, on lui a beaucoup souligné que beaucoup on croit ça, que la personne qui l'a assassiné, c'était pour ces questions, mais pas du tout, du coup. Et il en a profité pour parler d'un site, donc bridge.georgetown.edu, sur les questions d'islamophobie en France, dans plein d'autres pays, où ce site a beaucoup de la question, donc bridge comme bridge.georgetown.edu. C'est dans la conversation.
Il n'a pas l'air de marcher.
Okay, I think it is not www, but only bridge.georgetown.edu. And I think
You may have to use www. I don't know. I've never.
tried, and it is not working. So I think it's as you said, without 3W. But someone is asking then the motive for the assassination. Do you know it?
No. I do know that most people aren't aware of this, but a number of years later, the person who was in prison had a lawyer that was trying to bring up an acceptable excuse for what he did or his motivation, and so the person was claiming that based on the way he was reading the Quran, he drew this conclusion. Now that's what the lawyer was saying, but it never got off the ground because I had been contacted by a member of the Faruqi family who asked me if I'd be willing to testify during a court case, and it didn't get off the ground. I think it was somebody who was attracted to a certain interpretation of Islam, or at least the way he sort of saw it. There could be a kind of militant side to the nation at that time, Nation of Islam, and only God knows, why, he did that or came up to it. But he clearly knew the Faruqis and had been to their home, at least the reports that I've heard.
Et ajouter que j'ai oublié de ce qu'il a dit tout à l'heure, mais que la personne qui a signé du coup le professeur Al-Faruqi connaissait bien le couple, était déjà allé chez eux, donc c'était quelqu'un de proche apparemment, donc qui était lié à Nation of Islam, et que il y a quelques temps après l'assassinat, l'avocat du tueur du coup avait essayé de construire forcément une justification, et que ce qui était ressorti, parce que quelqu'un demandait la raison de l'assassinat du coup. Ce qui était dit, c'était une interprétation du tueur, une interprétation du Coran par le tueur qui fait que ça l'a poussé à faire cet acte, mais professeur Esposito, on ne sait pas forcément plus. Thank you very much for accepting to answer this.
I add to that, to what John said. I know the murderer because he used to be moving among us, the students at Temple University. He used to join us on many occasions, and also to attend the lectures by Professor Ismail Al-Faruqi. And he did the assassination, he did the killing, and he even attended the janaza funeral. And then we did not, and I remember he used to come even to join us for dinner in our dorms where we were staying, but we did not know that he was a person. Only later on, when the tip was given to the police, and an anonymous tip, that way they found out that this was this person. His name was Yusuf, and in my view, he had a psychological problem, and he was a convert to Islam in prison, and he carried a lot of baggage with him, and he had psychological problems. Because he testified, and I attended the trials, that he heard voices telling him to go and kill Faruqi.
Okay.
And it's interesting, that was never covered in the media and never really even put out there, when I think about it, by some Muslim organizations. Right. Because I think it was embarrassing to have that kind of personality. But it's amazing, what you're saying. Okay, I have never heard nor seen it, in writing, and that perpetuates the false rumors. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it is there in the Philadelphia Inquirer reports on that, on the trial, but no Muslim organization has submitted to that view.
Professeur Imtiyaz apportait plus d'informations en disant qu'en fait, c'était un étudiant du professeur Al-Faruqi et que le professeur Imtiyaz l'avait même croisé plusieurs fois, il l'avait fréquenté dans des cours et ils avaient aussi participé à des dîners ensemble et que c'est une personne qui, en fait, avait des problèmes psychologiques, qui était passé par la prison et qui s'est converti après ou pendant la prison, en tout cas, qui avait un passé par rapport à ça. Et du coup, le professeur Imtiyaz a assisté au jugement, était là au tribunal. Donc, il y a aussi tout ce contexte-là. Et professeur Esposito disait que ça a été très peu médiatisé, cet assassinat, et même pas relayé, pas forcément beaucoup relayé par les organisations musulmanes, aussi parce que la situation était en particulier embarrassante, puisque c'était un étudiant, un converti à un étudiant du professeur qui l'avait assassiné. Mais voilà.
Okay. One question, this is important. This is the last question for John. And sorry, Melissa, we are texting you so much. The question is that, okay, just as Faruqi enriched Islamic studies in the United States, the question to John is that in the light of Islamophobia in France and in Europe, what do you advise how the French students can enrich the field of Islamic studies going beyond the simplistics? Can you advise?
Well, I think that, well, first of all, it's very difficult if you're a French student because you're living in the environment, the Islamophobic environment. But I really think it's important to make it part of your jihad in life. I mean, to make it part of life as a struggle. And this is an important area to be aware and to do what one can do. This is a phenomenon that's gotten completely out of control. I expected after 9/11 that things would be bad for maybe 5 or 10 years. And I remember somebody I really respected saying 20 years. And what we're seeing today is that it's as deep-rooted, in France, it goes from the far right to the far left in terms of aspects of Islamophobia. Austria is the same, Germany, the issues in the US, but particularly, or not particularly, but also now, the Uyghurs, what's going on in India, the Rohingya. I think Muslims should be aware of this. And this may not answer it completely directly, but, one of the interesting things that I found when, for example, when I was at Holy Cross, students wanted, which was a Catholic college, students wanted us to hire a top scholar who was African-American and could do Catholicism. So you hire them, right? And then the African-American students, many of them didn't take the course. Why? Because they felt they didn't have that much to learn from it. The same thing can happen when it comes to Islam and Islamic studies and Muslims. We have a fair number of Muslims at Georgetown, and they're Muslims, of the universities, and many of them take time to learn their faith. We just introduced a minor in Islam, and I've had several Muslims who signed up for it. But there are others who just feel no need, either because they don't want to deal with it, or also their sense is, what am I really going to learn about this? This is for people who aren't Muslim. I think it's very important for people to know about their faith, not just to know, yes, the faith in terms of the theology, but also the realities on the ground, to be able to respond to those realities, to be aware of them, and to be in a position when you happen to be someplace and when you can do it without, I'm not inviting anybody to do anything where they'll get in trouble or whatever, but, it is a reality. And it's out there, and we know there have been hate crimes committed. I've had death threats in the past and other, other kinds of situations. It's lessened for me anyway now. A lot of running 5 miles. One thing is that we do have Muslims, for example, in the United States, who have trained and can hold positions, whether it's in social organizations dealing with Muslim rights or as scholars. You know, in the old days, you couldn't, if you advertised a job, there weren't many young.
Sorry for that. If I knew that one day a non-Muslim would tell me to make jihad and to learn my faith, I would not believe that. It could lead me to ask you the one question that everybody asks you, but I won't do it. Maybe I will do it by email privately, but
Ask me.
Sorry?
If you want to ask me something now, you can ask.
It is the question that everybody asks you, wherever you go, whatever you are evoking. You already know the question, but
Yeah.
I won't. Yes.
Okay, I'll end with this story.
Yes, okay.
I get it all the time. You know, I would go to be checking into a hotel in Saudi Arabia, and somebody would come up to me and say, it's so good to see you, mashallah, mashallah. I heard about, and I would say, I already know what you're going to say. I would have lunch at Oxford with professors, and one of them was a Muslim, and I come out, and he said, you know, there's a rumor from Canada about you. And I said, I already know the rumor. Okay, I was at a conference, a closed conference in the UAE. Actually, there's a video. Al Jazeera just did a program, an interview with me, in which I tell this story. I've never said it, but now that I've told the story. So at the last session, I give him my talk. The last session was a panel. Okay, I was tired. I had traveled, etc. And I was the last speaker. And it was supposed to be a panel discussion. Well, people went on and just talked too long. So I didn't want to have to do another presentation. So I said, okay, this is a closed conference. People have been asking about my identity for a long time. And I feel now I can respond to it. There were some British diplomats, Americans, Muslims, young, older. I said, I thought for a while, and I looked down like this. And I said, it's very difficult for me to now, you know, address this issue and come out on it, but it's true. I do dye my hair, okay? Well, the Brits and others looked like this guy's having a breakdown, okay? The younger Muslims came up to me, scholars, and said, you could hear the older ones going, mashallah, mashallah, and then the disappointment. So I leave you with the fact that that answer to the question is between me and God.
Oh.
Yes, thank you. Very good.
I really have to translate that, and we would be, I think, if there is no other question. So, and Professor Imtiyaz, thank you very much for that question. It's really interesting, the one that you asked just before. Donc, Professeur Imtiyaz demandait comment les étudiants français musulmans, qui sont dans un contexte islamophobique bien particulier, comment peuvent-ils contribuer et essayer d'agir à leur échelle. Et donc, comme je disais au professeur Esposito que jamais de ma vie, je penserais qu'un non-musulman nous conseillerait ça, mais c'est d'en faire notre djihad, en fait, d'en faire ça veut surtout dire d'en faire une raison de vivre, que de se battre aussi pour sa communauté et pour ses droits. Et que effectivement, il reconnaissait que et il savait que c'était un contexte très compliqué en France, de l'extrême gauche à l'extrême droite, pardon, on est un peu assailli de toutes parts, mais que c'était très, très important d'apprendre sa religion, en fait. Il parlait des Islamic Studies, qu'en fait, par exemple, dans la fac où il est, parfois, il y a beaucoup d'étudiants musulmans, comme il disait, et certains étudiants musulmans ne voient pas la nécessité de prendre un cours sur l'islam en se disant, ça, je sais, en fait, je suis musulman, je n'ai pas besoin. Non, au contraire, en fait, il faut vraiment toujours continuer l'apprentissage et approfondir son apprentissage sur sa foi, sur sa religion et de l'autre côté, avoir conscience des réalités sur le terrain. Il nous disait, je ne vous invite pas à faire des choses qui peuvent vous apporter des problèmes, mais aussi d'avoir conscience de ces réalités et de les étudier pour pouvoir les combattre contre aussi toutes les choses qui nous menacent. Et du coup, je lui ai dit que la question me brûle sur mes lèvres de poser cette question que tout le monde lui pose, en gros, s'il s'est converti ou pas. Et il disait qu'il a rappelé une anecdote, I finish with the anecdote you told, où il était à une conférence, il avait voyagé pendant longtemps, il était fatigué, il est arrivé et c'était un panel, donc il y avait plusieurs chercheurs et lui, il était le dernier à passer et qu'à la fin, tout le monde posait la même question sur son identité, sur cette conversion ou pas conversion, surtout que peu importe où il va, tout le monde lui dit j'ai entendu une rumeur qui voilà. Et donc il expliquait juste qu'il était fatigué, il a dit devant tout le monde bon ok, je vais vous dire vous révéler ce que vous attendez. Et oui, effectivement, je me teins les cheveux. Donc bon, ça c'était pour la petite anecdote, mais en gros il a fini par dire que cette réponse reste entre lui et Dieu, qui est une réponse très noble, which is a really noble answer. So thank you for that.
Okay.
And
there's one last. Yeah, go ahead.
No, there is no other question for us. Is there any other question in the chat?
There's one last question, and I cannot let it go. And because since you're right, John has written a lot on Islamophobia. When do you think it will end?
Quand est-ce qu'il
John.
Only God knows. It's one time when that phrase really comes into play. It's like Palestine and Israel, the issue. When I was a young academic, my attitude, and I actually discussed this with somebody who had been in government, in a senior government position, because he finished his PhD at the same time I did. I said, I knew that surely in my lifetime, Palestine and Israel would be resolved. And recently I gave a talk in Austin, Texas, and I answered what you just said to the audience by saying, for me, I talked about the fact that unlike academics years ago who were working on it and then were retiring, it was like professionals who worked on a cure for cancer but retired and they still hadn't found it, and so there was an arrogance in my position. Now, the way I answered it in Austin, Texas was, it's going to take a long time. And they had invited me, it was their 20th anniversary. I had spoken when they launched the project. I said, invite me back in 20 years. I'll only be 103, and hopefully it will be resolved.
Donc la dernière question que le professeur Imtiyaz a posée, c'est quand est-ce que je vous l'ai dit, quand est-ce que l'islamophobie n'existera plus. Et donc only God knows, littéralement, seul Dieu sait, dit par professeur Esposito. Et il disait que c'est un peu la même chose que le conflit israélo-palestinien. On n'a pas l'impression que ça se terminera un jour, et il disait que surtout sur cette question du conflit, déjà lorsqu'il était professeur, on lui posait la question et on disait qu'il y avait beaucoup de choses qui étaient mises en place, de réflexion, de groupes de réflexion pour trouver des solutions, comme si on essayait de trouver un remède au cancer. Il disait ça d'une manière assez arrogante, mais en fait, si on lui reposait la question aujourd'hui, il dirait que ça prendra du temps et qu'il faudra lui reposer la question dans 20 ans et qu'il espère que ce sera fini d'ici là, quand il aura 103 ans. So, yeah. But as Muslims, it's not an academic answer, but as Muslims, if we read the Quran, we know that Muslims will be victorious in the end. So maybe we can finish on that. It's a general answer.
Okay.
I just wanted to say really, really from everyone here, and from everyone in the chat, I think, really thank you very much for being here. Maybe you wanted to ask something, Professor?
Yeah. I'm speaking on behalf of John. We'd like to thank you. Yeah, on behalf of John and me, we'd like to thank Malaysia for the hard work she has done. And I would like to also thank Brother Muhammad Oded, who is so passionate behind this whole series of talks here, lectures he has been arranging. So I will I'll call upon him to say a few words of thanks to Professor John. Brother Muhammad, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Professor Esposito, and you too, Professor Imtiyaz Yusuf. And I let Melissa finish.
Okay, I'll finish. So yes, thank you very much. We are really honored to we read about you and we can also talk to you. So we know that it's really a big chance to do that. So we are really truly honored. Thank you very much. Everyone, you can follow what we do, what we write as articles, etc. on our website, the name of the website is my name on Zoom. And feel free to contact us if you have any question or yes. But again, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And again, thank you very much, Professor Esposito and Professor Imtiyaz. It was really, really interesting. We are really honored. Thank you.
Programs I've ever done. It's one of the best programs I've ever done. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.
Merci de ta confiance. On reste en contact? Tu veux accéder à plus de ressources pertinentes et participer au projet? Rends-toi sur islamactuel.org et Facebook, Instagram, YouTube et les plateformes de podcast. Merci et à bientôt. Salam.